The envelope is already open on the kitchen table. The paper inside is heavier than a normal bill, folded twice. The county seal pressed into the corner like something official enough to end an argument. He already paid off the house 10 years ago. The deed is in a drawer. No bank, no mortgage, no monthly payment. And yet the number on the page is higher than last year. Again. And if it keeps rising, the house can leave him before he ever chooses to sell it. He runs his thumb along the edge of the paper without reading it a second time. People do that when they already understand what it says. You work, you save, you buy a home, you pay it off, and one day the cost disappears. Shelter becomes permanent, fixed, safe. A finished transaction. That idea still lives on closing days. You see it in the photos families holding a mortgage-paid sign, smiling like they've crossed a finish line that used to mean something, but the number didn't disappear. It just changed names. This is how middle-class wealth gets drained. Not all at once, but through a bill that resets every year. The house is his. The land is his. The paperwork says so. But the bill keeps coming, and it doesn't ask what he earns now. It doesn't care that his income stopped growing 5 years ago. It doesn't notice that groceries cost more, that insurance climbed, that the margin is gone. The number only moves one direction. A neighbor down the street got a similar envelope last spring. Same house, same street, same routine. The assessment jumped 50%. He didn't renovate, he didn't upgrade, but the system upgraded his obligation anyway. Nothing about the house changed. Same roof, same square footage, same creaking step near the hallway, but the value on paper rose anyway. The text followed it upward like a shadow that never detaches. One line on the page does all the work: assessed value. It looks like a measurement. It behaves like a decision. There's a quiet moment people don't talk about when they realize the house is not a finished purchase, but an ongoing obligation with no end date. You can see it in how long they stare at the second page, where the breakdown sits in smaller print. Ownership is supposed to be absolute. The reality is conditional, and that single line item is where ownership quietly stops being permanent and becomes something that has to be paid for every year again. The mechanism is not hidden because it is secret. It is hidden because it is ordinary. It's the same process that sent that envelope, and it has already decided what that number needs to become next year. Local governments run on a simple equation: fixed obligations, variable revenue. Police salaries, school payrolls, pension promises made decades ago. Those numbers do not shrink when the economy slows. They sit there due every month regardless of what residents earn. When revenue falls short, something has to adjust. Property taxes are the adjustment, not because they are fair, because they are reliable. The bill on the kitchen table is the physical endpoint of that system. It is not calculated from what the homeowner can pay. It is calculated from what the municipality needs to collect. The difference gets resolved through one quiet lever: reassessment. That single line, assessed value, is where the system reaches into the property and changes its output. Here's the first dependency layer. Cities depend on stable or rising property values to maintain revenue without politically visible tax rate hikes. If home prices in a nearby development rise, or if comparable sales increase, the assessment follows. The logic is mechanical. The effect is not. The second layer sits underneath it. Many municipalities are carrying obligations that were structured for a different era: pensions based on longer careers, lower life expectancy, and stronger tax bases. Those promises still exist. The funding behind them often does not. The gap doesn't disappear. It gets distributed. It doesn't ask what your house produces. It asks what it needs your house to produce. It shows up here. The first visible consequence is not foreclosure. It is a number that no longer matches reality. A homeowner earning $48,000 a year receives a tax bill calculated as if their house is a liquid asset producing income. It isn't. It's a place to live. This is the moment where belief and reality separate. The belief says taxes reflect ability to pay. The reality is they reflect the municipality's need to collect. I've seen people hold those two ideas at the same time, just long enough to hesitate before writing the check. A retiree in this situation feels it immediately. 40 years of payments, the mortgage gone, the house fully owned. Then a reassessment pushes the annual tax from $3,200 a poor $800, a 50% increase. Her pension does not adjust. The grocery bill already did. The insurance premium already did. The tax is just the last piece to move. The transaction is simple. The county sends a bill. The due date passes. A penalty is added. Interest begins to accrue, 8%, sometimes higher depending on jurisdiction. It compounds quietly. Months pass. Then the lien appears. This is where the process shifts from accounting to enforcement. The unpaid tax is no longer just a balance. It becomes a claim against the property itself. That claim can be sold often to a private investor for a fraction of its value, with the right to collect the full amount plus interest. The house, fully paid off, is now collateral again. In this structure, ownership isn't a status. It's a condition that has to be maintained. There is a moment most people never anticipate. It is not dramatic. No one knocks on the door. A notice arrives, another envelope, another deadline. The numbers are still small enough to rationalize, just large enough to strain. They don't panic yet. They fold the notice, set it aside, and tell themselves they'll deal with it next month. This is how failure begins, before anyone calls it failure. There was a time when ownership meant managing what you could see. A roof, a fence, a field. If you maintained it, it remained yours. Today, the critical variable is not physical upkeep. It is compliance with a system that updates your obligation without your participation. The old method did not fail. The surrounding system changed. Money in this structure is not just currency. It is time you can buy before the next notice arrives. And when that access runs out, the process does not stop. It accelerates. Because from the municipality's perspective, the outcome is already defined. The revenue must be collected. The only question is from whom and in what order. And for most people, that order is invisible until their name is already on the list. And this is the part that feels new but isn't. The pattern rising obligations detached from income, enforced through legal process rather than forces already played out before, at scale, against people who also believed their land was secure. The auction yard is quiet in a way that doesn't feel natural. Boots on gravel, hands in pockets, men standing in a loose circle, not speaking unless they have to. In the center, a small table, a ledger, and a farm that is about to change hands without ever moving. It is the early 1930s. The official story says the crisis is about collapsing crop prices. Corn, wheat, livestock, everything is selling for less. Income falls. Debts become harder to service. That is the explanation most people remember, but that is not what took the land. Between 1930 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of American farms were lost. Not because the farmer stopped working. Not because the land stopped producing. In many cases, the soil was the same. The labor was the same. The routines were the same. What changed was the obligation attached to the land. Crop prices fell by as much as 78%, but local property taxes did not fall with them. In many areas, they rose. Counties still needed revenue. Roads, schools, local services, and debts did not disappear just because the harvest brought in less cash. The gap had to be filled. It was filled through the same mechanism. The bill arrived. The due date passed. The penalty accumulated. And eventually, the land was not taken. By force it was processed. That is the part history tends to smooth over. A farmer could stand on land his family had worked for generations, hold the deed in his hand, and still lose it through a courtroom that treated unpaid taxes as a simple accounting failure. No soldiers, no confrontation, just a sequence of legal steps that converted land into revenue. The first to go were the ones with the least flexibility. Farmers who were land-rich but cash-poor, men whose wealth was tied up in acreage, equipment, and livestock, but whose cash flow depended entirely on market prices they did not control. There is a detail that stays with you. At some of these auctions, neighbors would gather not to bid competitively, but to resist. Penny auctions, they called them. A farm worth thousands would receive bids of a few cents. Outsiders were discouraged, sometimes physically, from participating. The goal was simple: keep the land in the hands of the family by breaking the auction mechanism itself. A single coin on a table. That was the line between ownership and loss. Some succeeded, many did not. What survived were not just assets, but systems around them. Households that had some form of liquidity, however small. Communities that coordinated. People who could stretch time delay, negotiate, absorb one more season. Survival depended on one thing: how long you could keep paying for what you already owned. It was about the ability to meet the obligation attached to it. There was a time when owning land meant you controlled its output. You could plant more, store more, work longer, and bridge a bad season. Today, that kind of control is limited. The obligation is external, calculated elsewhere, updated without negotiation. The important detail is not the price collapse. It is where the dependency was sitting. Back then, it was the tax bill that didn't adjust when income disappeared. Now the structure is cleaner, more administrative, easier to process at scale. The language is softer. The outcome is the same, and once you see it that way, the question changes. It is no longer whether a system can take productive land from people who own it. It is who runs out of time first before the system runs out of claims. The first people to feel this are not reckless. They are not overleveraged. They are not speculating. They are the ones who did everything the system told them to do. They open the envelope expecting stability and find a number that no longer belongs to their income. Retirees on fixed incomes, homeowners who paid off their mortgages, farmers whose wealth sits in land, not cash, people whose balance sheet looks solid on paper, but whose monthly cash flow has no room to expand. They pay first because their income is static while the obligation is not. A retired couple opens the same kind of envelope at a quiet kitchen table. The house is worth more now, at least on paper. The tax bill reflects that. Their pension does not. The number on the page rises. Their income doesn't follow. The gap has to come from somewhere else. Savings, smaller purchases, deferred maintenance, a decision about which bill waits. That is where the pressure starts. Not with collapse, but with substitution. This is the belief that breaks here. People assume that owning an asset outright protects them from rising costs. The reality is that ownership without liquidity can become a liability when the cost of holding that asset is externally controlled. A farmer feels the same pressure differently. His land is reassessed based on nearby development, new houses, higher sale prices, a different market than the one his crops serve. His revenue is tied to yields and commodity prices that may be falling. His tax bill is tied to a valuation that is rising. He didn't change his operation. The system changed the terms around it. There's a moment that tends to go unnoticed. He stands at a counter, looking at an invoice, fuel, seed, fertilizer, calculating what the season might bring in. Then he looks at the tax bill. One depends on the weather and the market. The other doesn't. He doesn't move right away. He just stands there, doing the math twice. I've seen that pause before. It's not panic. It's recognition. Meanwhile, the system has another side to it. Unpaid taxes do not disappear. They become assets. A tax lien, just a line item in a county ledger, can be sold to an investor at a discount, sometimes a fraction of its face value, with the right to collect the full amount plus interest. What is a burden for the homeowner becomes a yield for someone else. The same pressure that forces one person to sell time is what allows another to buy it. This is where the benefit sits, not in the house itself, but in the claim attached to it. The advantage is structural. Institutions and investors operate with liquidity, time, and legal access. They can wait. They can absorb delays. They can purchase claims across many properties, spreading risk in a way an individual household cannot. The gap shows up in something as simple as an account balance. One side is calculating how to cover a $4,800 bill without touching retirement savings. The other is evaluating whether buying that claim at a discount yields 8% or 12% over time. Same number, different position. There was a time when households handled more of their exposure directly. Food, fuel, repairs, things you could produce, store, or fix. Today, most of those functions are external. You access them through systems, utilities, supply chains, regulated services that require steady payment. Having money is one thing. Having uninterrupted access is another. And when access depends on maintaining payments across multiple systems at once, a single rising obligation can begin to crowd out everything else. The older model didn't disappear because it failed. It was replaced by efficiency, by specialization, by scale. It works until one input begins to move in a way the household cannot match. That is when what looks valuable on paper stops working in real life. And it leads to a harder question. Not who is struggling today, but what still looks secure, stable, valuable, even enviable, while quietly depending on the same kind of external input that can change without warning. The kind of asset people point to and say, at least this is safe. The house looks like the safest place to store wealth. A family sits inside it, unaware that the cost of keeping it is still moving. Solid structure, fist address, rising value printed on paper year after year. In certain neighborhoods, the numbers climb so consistently that the property begins to feel like a savings account you can live inside. That is the illusion. The fragility sits in the same place it always has, on the line that updates without your input. A large home in a high-value district carries a larger assessed value. That value becomes a larger tax obligation. As public liabilities expand, pensions, infrastructure, long-term commitments, The pressure to extract revenue concentrates on the properties that appear able to carry it. The safer it looks, the more it is asked to produce. There's a detail most people miss. A pristine house with no debt can still generate a bill that behaves like one. It arrives annually, adjusts upward, and does not disappear when income slows. The object is the same. The function has changed. This is where belief and reality separate again. The belief says higher value property is a form of protection. The reality is that higher value property can become a larger surface area for extraction. Historically, what survived this kind of pressure was not the highest value asset. It was the system around it. In the 1930s, families who held on were not always the ones with the most land. They were the ones who could meet the obligation attached to it long enough to outlast the cycle. Sometimes that meant access to cash. Sometimes it meant a community that could intervene. Sometimes it meant having reserves that were not tied up in the asset itself. A jar of preserved food on a cellar shelf. A small reserve of cash set aside for taxes rather than expansion. A network of neighbors willing to show up when the auction was called. These were not dramatic advantages. They were functional ones. Survival came from the ability to bridge time. The difference is easy to miss. Households once carried more of their resilience in forms they could see and manage: directly, food stored, tools maintained, obligations understood in physical terms. Today, most of that resilience is abstracted into accounts, valuations, and systems that operate at a distance. Those older methods did not stop working. They were displaced by convenience, by efficiency, by the assumption that stable systems would handle the gaps. They do until they don't. A family today tries to solve the same problem differently. Instead of putting every available dollar into the house, they hold a portion back liquid, accessible, designated for the one bill that cannot be negotiated. 5 years of property tax set aside, not invested in the property, not optimized for return, just available. It looks inefficient on paper. It means choosing not to grow the asset in order to keep it. It functions differently in practice. There's a scene that captures it. A man opens a small safe, not large, just enough to hold documents and a stack of cash. He counts it once, then again, not because he doubts the number, but because he's measuring time, how many years of that bill it can absorb if it keeps rising. It is not a perfect solution. It ties up capital that could be used elsewhere. It requires discipline to maintain. It assumes the rules won't change faster than the reserve can cover. It does nothing to stop the assessment itself. But it changes the position of the person holding it. It turns a fixed deadline into something that can be extended. I've noticed that what survives is rarely the most efficient structure. It is the one with the most tolerance for delay, friction, and error. And that leads to the final tension. In a system where obligations are updated externally and enforced consistently, the difference between keeping an asset and losing it is often not the value of the asset itself, but the ability to carry its cost through time. Paper value can grow. It can look impressive. It can even feel secure. But when the bill arrives, it does not care what the house is worth. It only cares whether it gets paid. And most people don't realize which side they're on until the number shows up. You were told that once the mortgage was gone, the house was yours. That was the promise. What changed was not the paper you signed. It was the condition attached to keeping it. Ownership didn't disappear. It became something that has to be maintained year after year against a number that can move without you. A deed in a drawer. A bill on the table. Those two things used to agree with each other. Now they don't always. If the obligation rises faster than your ability to meet it, the system does not pause. It does not negotiate. It converts the difference into a process, and the process into an outcome. Quietly, legally, completely. That is the shift. There was a time when keeping what you owned depended mostly on what you could do with your hands. Repair it, grow from it, store for later, adjust your life around it. Today, keeping what you owned depends on staying current with systems that can raise the price of access without asking you first. The old way didn't stop working. It became something most people no longer rely on. I keep coming back to a simple image. A kitchen table at night, a bill folded in half. A hand resting on it a little longer than usual, not because it's confusing, but because it's final. That is where ownership stops being an idea and becomes a test. Resilience is not about having more on paper. It is about having a pathway when the number on the paper stops converting into time, into options, into auctions. And when that moment comes, the distinction becomes clear. You either have a way to carry the obligation, or the obligation carries you out of the asset.